Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's Star Trek lore video, we're going to talk about a situation that seems to come up a lot, namely, why is the Enterprise apparently the only ship in range whenever a crisis is going on? So we're going to analyze a couple of different factors to see if we can come up with an in-universe explanation for this, although we know of course in real life this is just done for dramatic effect. But we're nerds here, so let's come up with something to explain it in the context of the universe of the show. The first thing we're going to talk about is the size of the Federation. A while back I did a whole video on this subject. I'll throw a link in if you want to check it out. But in summary, we came up with the supposition that the core part of the Federation is approximately 200 light years across. If we go from this and assume that the Federation is a sphere of approximately 200 light year diameter, we would come up with a volume of 4.2 million cubic light years. Now that's a lot of space. By the way, I got confirmation for some of these calculations from an article on the website Ex Astra Scientia for their discussion of the size of the Federation and Starfleet. Now let's compare this to the idea of a sector. Now that the exact size of a sector is never stated on screen. However, according to the Star Trek Encyclopedia, a sector is about 20 light years across, and as we can see, they are approximately cube-shaped. So, with that assumption in mind, if we compare the size of a sector to the assumed volume of Federation space, this works out to about 524 sectors as an estimate of the size of the Federation. Now let's keep that number 524 in mind, and then we're going to discuss the size of Starfleet. We don't get a whole lot of information about the exact size of Starfleet, but we can draw some conclusions based on the evidence we do see on screen. That despite the apparent lack of starships in the original series in TNG, we have large fleets of ships fighting Dominion in DS9. In particular, if you look at the dialogue in DS9, we know that there are at least 10 fleets of starships. And based on some lines in the episode Favor the Bold, Captain Sisko during Operation Return is commanding 2 Federation fleets that total 600 ships, so presumably each fleet has about 300 starships in it. This obviously can vary. We don't know the exact number of fleets, but we can, if we take these for a ballpark figure, we get a calculation of about 3,000 starships in the Starfleet, that's a lot of ships, especially compared to the always chronic lack of starships in crises and other times in the past. But we'll get to that in just a minute. If we assume Starfleet has about 3,000 starships, and that the Federation consists of about 524 sectors, if we evenly distribute the starships just within the core of the Federation, that would work out to less than 6 starships per sector. However, we know for certain that it's going to be less than this in most cases. For one, a large percentage of Starfleet would most likely be outside the Federation on exploratory missions. Furthermore, even during a time of relative peace, there would be other powers surrounding the Federation that could be a threat, and therefore Starfleet would likely have more ships assigned along the border with powers such as the Romulans or the Cardassians. For example, we can see in the tachyon detection grid that Captain Picard used during the Klingon Civil War. He was able to assemble about 20 starships. Furthermore, when the Borg threatened Earth in Best of Both Worlds, Starfleet managed to pull together about 40 ships at Wolf 359. Why only 40 ships against the Borg versus thousands of ships versus the Dominion? Well, my supposition is that during the time of TNG and before, Starfleet was very much spread out. They didn't have many ships stationed around Earth or other core worlds, and thus, for Wolf 359, the Borg threat arose so quickly that 40 ships was all that they had time to pull together. Whereas for the Dominion War, there were years of build-up, allowing Starfleet to recall some of their ships and to concentrate them into these large fleets that we saw during the war. And specifically, I want to address the issue of even around Earth, there seems to be very few starships available. A general explanation for this, I think, can be provided by what we mentioned earlier, is that Starfleet, the bulk of it would probably be stationed either along the borders or even outside Federation space. Thus, it wouldn't be much need for them to have a bunch of starships hanging around Earth during times of relative peace. But there is one specific example I want to look at, and that's namely the Enterprise B at the beginning of Star Trek Generations. We have a newly launched ship with not even a full crew, and many of her key systems not even installed yet since it's not Tuesday. And yet, this Enterprise B is still the only ship in range to rescue the El-Orien ships from the Nexus. So why would this be the case? To possibly answer this, we're going to back up a little bit to Star Trek 3, where the Excelsior has recently been equipped with a new transwarp drive. And according to statements from Captain Styles, he is very confident that the Enterprise with standard warp drive has no chance of getting away from the Excelsior. So clearly, transwarp is tended to be much faster. Now, there are some reference materials that assume that the transwarp experiment was a failure, and that later the Excelsior was fitted with a normal warp drive. However, there is lacking evidence for this assumption on screen. So I'm going to make a different assumption, is that the transwarp experiment was actually successful, and therefore the Enterprise B herself was also equipped with transwarp, being a new Excelsior-class ship. Now, Generations take place not long after Star Trek 6. So I would imagine that transwarp drives are still very rare on Starfleet ships in this scenario, making the Excelsior-class ships by far the fastest ships in the fleet at that point. So when the Enterprise B receives a distress call from the El-Orien ships, which are said to be 3 light years away, that the Enterprise B, even though it just left Earth, is the only ship in range because it is the only ship fast enough to be able to reach the El-Orien ships with any chance of saving them, because any other ships around Earth, if there are any, would be too slow to get there in time to make a difference. So, to summarize what we've been covering in this video, why is the Enterprise often the only ship in range? In short, because space is huge and Starfleet was stretched pretty thin, at least until threats from the Borg and the Dominion probably motivated them to pull some of their starships back in. So, but what do you think about this theory? I welcome any comments or suggestions down below. Thank you for joining me again, and I hope you have a blessed day.